Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hello and welcome to Side Quests. My name is Greg Sewart. I'm the co-host of the Player One podcast and the producer of Generation 16, which is a cron gaming YouTube series focused entirely on the Genesis and Mega Drive. I'm honored to have been invited to come on to the show and talk about Lunar, the Silver Star, which is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. I'd say one of the best RPGs of its generation, and it just happens that it's on one of my favorite consoles of all time, the Sega CD. The early 90s, I feel, was like a really interesting time for role-playing games in general. There was a real shift happening, and a lot of that had to do, I say, with Squaresoft. We were fairly new on the console side here in the Western world. We were fairly new to role-playing games. It hadn't been that long since we've been introduced by Nintendo to Dragon Warrior, or also actually by Nintendo to Final Fantasy, as well as Sega with the Phantasy Star series. Those were kind of the tentpole franchises as far as RPG fans were concerned. And while the first RPGs on the NES were fantastic, I'm personally a huge fan of Final Fantasy, they were pretty basic. I mean, from a narrative perspective, from a storytelling perspective, they were interesting in that you still had these big sprawling quests, but they were also they were very straightforward. You know, you have these heroes, they have a quest, Dragon Warrior, go save the princess and defeat the dragon. Final Fantasy was a little more involved in that, but still, you set your party at the beginning of the game, and then you went for it. Phantasy Star was definitely more intricate, but it wasn't something that I experienced until much later because, of course, it was trapped on the Master System at the time, and not many people had Master Systems in this part of the world, myself included. But with the advent of the Super Nintendo, and especially Final Fantasy IV, which, of course, came here as Final Fantasy II, the whole idea of a more stirring narrative really took hold. We still had the very simple, super deformed graphics, but in Final Fantasy II, I'm going to keep using the American numbering system here, you had many moments of sort of dramatic gravitas. You had a lot of pauses. You had a lot of dialogue and exposition happening there that added this whole new layer to the RPG experience, in my opinion. And also the fact that you had characters sort of swapping in, coming out of the party. It felt more like experiencing the narrative of a film than, picking your heroes and being set on a path and just sort of getting to the end of that path and now you win. So it was really exciting to see what was happening on the Super Nintendo side of things as far as RPGs goes. Plus, we were getting a lot more RPGs in general on the Super Nintendo. Now, sitting over in the Genesis camp, we weren't completely bereft of role-playing games. We had the Phantasy Star series, although by the point that Lunar came out, the most recent Phantasy Star game had been Phantasy Star 3, which I think was an amazing premise, but was a really disappointing game in general. So, there was definitely a layer of sort of longing staring over to the Super Nintendo side of things if you didn't have one of those consoles, but you were an RPG fan, as I was. I want to play that stuff. I want that stuff on my system. So that sort of sets the stage, I think, for how important Lunar was when it came out. But further to that, again, talking about another system that I think a whole lot of people in this part of the world and I myself didn't really own was, of course, the TurboGrafx 16. And through reading magazines and through seeing demos, I especially remember going to Radio Shack and seeing the TurboGrafx CD add-on being demoed with Ys Book 1 and 2. And, of course, this most striking thing about Ys Book 1 and 2 was the full-screen animated anime. They were mostly heads, the cinematic scenes where you had these really extreme close-ups of the characters. They were mind-blowing at the time, and they really scratched an itch where in role-playing games where you were stuck with these sort of super deformed representations of the characters that did look pretty, but weren't super emotive or hadn't been up to that point. It was really fascinating to see a medium that would allow you to appreciate sort of the character design of all these main characters, and also to hear their voices, which was something, of course, we didn't get in cartridge games. So when the Sega CD came out, it kind of really all started to come together. And I remember getting my Sega CD for the first time in the software bundle that came with it included Soul Feast, which was a pretty, decent shooter. There wasn't anything super memorable about it, but one thing that it did do that always stuck with me was that it had actually 2 fully animated opening sequences. And while we were already used to the idea of full motion video on a CD-ROM game, on the Sega CD, especially because, again, Sherlock Holmes came in that list, in that box, and we all knew about Sewer Shark and Night Trap. So the idea of fully animated sequences or full motion video wasn't necessarily super mind-blowing by the time we got our hands on a Sega CD. The idea of full screen sort of sprite-based anime-style cutscenes was. It was to me anyway. All I remember, my experience with it up to that point had been seeing the demo of East Book 1 and 2, or seeing screenshots and magazines of games. Again, a few of them brought over by Working Designs, where you would, see these fully animated, full-screen anime-style cutscenes that I just loved. And when I say anime-style, I mean that art style, the stuff that we were used to seeing over here in shows like Robotech. I'm a huge Robotech fan, so, that's what I'm referencing. So Soul Feast stayed stuck in my mind mainly because of that. I would let that thing run. I would show that to my friends. When my friends came over, I was like, you got to see this. Because, again, full motion video was a thing, but these sprite-based animations didn't have the graininess. They weren't stuck in these tiny little windows, which is what we were dealing with in the advent of CD-ROM on console. So, and they were color limited, but they were built for the system they were on, as opposed to, analog video that had been crushed down to fit on the system that it was on. So it was exciting. And, again, super hungry for an RPG. So Lunar the Silver Star coming along when it did was, I think, the perfect time, because it was created. Lunar the Silver Star was created to focus more on narrative than just sort of the humdrum RPG trappings, which I think if you go to the Wikipedia page, you'll see something very similar. Game Arts actually, said something where they were trying to break away from the humdrum model of RPGs. So what we got was something not wholly original, but something that was more focused on story and narrative, which is what I was looking for, and which I think RPG players in general back then were getting excited about, was great storytelling. And Working Designs, for all its faults, was focused on that as well. That seemed to be the most important aspect of the game to them, too. So it was exciting that this finally came out. We were reading about it in magazines for quite a while, but I remember turning it on for the first time and hearing a theme song to open up the game, fully in English. And again, with these gorgeous, fully animated scenes that really sort of set the tone for what you're about to experience. The game itself, and again, you're going to hear some spoilers here, I would say. The game itself, the storyline is actually pretty straightforward. The storyline is basically Star Wars, to be honest. Alex, the main character, is basically Luke Skywalker. You're this sort of, nothing super exceptional about you. This kid from a mountain town who has sort of grand dreams, which I think a lot of people can relate to. The Dragon Master, Dine, from a previous generation who had helped save the goddess Althena, was from Berg, which I think the name of the town Berg is a little bit on the nose, but was from Berg, this tiny little mountain town where Alex grew up as well. So, of course, Alex has dreams of something bigger than just being in this little town, and knows, because of Dragon Master Dine, the fact that he came from this town as well meant that it is actually possible to get out from under the thumb of this sort of small town world. And it kind of just goes from there. One of the things that I really love about Lunar that really, you saw it in previous games. The Final Fantasy games, the games weren't really connected. The Phantasy Star series, they were, but they were connected over 1,000 years. So, any history you had in Phantasy Star 2 that related to the previous game was 1,000 years old. And any history you found in Phantasy Star 3 that related to the previous game was 2,000 years old. What I love about Lunar is that the history and sort of the big epic battle that shaped the world that you're in only happened a generation ago, to the point that the 4 heroes, Dine, Mel, Galleon and Lemia are, well, 3 of them are still alive. Dine was killed, but 3 of them are still alive. And the people you're dealing with, the NPCs in the world, lived through, a lot of them, the adults anyway, lived through these sort of cataclysmic events that the 4 heroes are famous for. So you don't feel so far removed. You feel that you're in a world that's coming out from the shadow of these big events, and sort of like the celebratory nature of it has worn off, and everything's become kind of humdrum, to use a term we've already stated. And I just love that idea. And again, it's very Star Wars, which the game director has called out is what a major inspiration was for the story, where, you know, Alex is looking up literally to somebody from a generation ahead of him, somebody his father knew because they were in Berg together and may have actually hung out with. So that in itself, I think, really made the story stand apart from what I was used to in role-playing games at the time. Again, I'm not saying that Lunar was the first to do something like this, but the first one I remember doing something like this. And you've also got a little bit of what I would say Frozen, which I think the story that was based on was the Ice Queen in Luna. So you've got Luna, who's like an adopted sister. She's very mysterious, but she goes on Alex on his first little quest with his friend Ramus to go get a diamond, because Ramus, of course, dreams of being rich. And that's kind of how the story goes. And it doesn't start on this grand scale. It starts on this sort of little quest to a little cave near this little town that, you know, the result of which is that they meet a dragon for the first time, and the dragon tells Alex that he senses in him the same strength that Dine had, and he should become a dragon master. And that sort of sets Alex off on the hero's quest, where it's, you know, he goes and he meets some of his old heroes. He has to undergo like 4 trials, and in the end needs to save the world. You know, nothing but just saving the world. And again, I love that through all of this, you meet the other 3 heroes, and one of them turns out to be the big bad, the Magic Emperor. But even his reasons for what he's doing are, I don't want to say noble, but you feel a little bit of empathy for him, because he's trying to avenge his fallen friend, and he blames sort of the goddess and the establishment that he fought so hard to save for the death of his friend. So all very cool. And, you know, in sticking with the Star Wars motif, you get to the point where you get to the Magic Emperor's Death Star and have that final fight with him, save the girl, and win the game. But it's a very straightforward story, and honestly, it's so openly telegraphed, some of the people that you meet, who they are, that are I think surprises to the characters in the story. Like even the fact that Luna is there, and it's telegraphed very early on that she's a very important character through the main story. You don't care. Even when I was first playing it, I just didn't care that it was so obvious what was going on. It'd be equivalent to, sticking with the Star Wars thing, to knowing that Darth Vader was Luke's father in the first act of the first film. Like, that's how openly telegraphed some of these things are. And I just remember when I was playing it, I didn't care that I kind of had figured that out by then. The reveal wasn't the point. The journey was the point, and seeing the characters go on this journey was the point. And that they were so rich and wonderfully characterized and wonderfully written in general made it all the better. Again, going back to something like Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior, which, you know, on the NES, the main characters in those games were they didn't have personalities. They were just vessels. And Alex, in a lot of ways here, doesn't have a lot of personality. He's just a vessel. His personality is actually carried by his little white flying cat companion, Null. Like, that's where the personality comes from for the main character. Otherwise, you know, he's just sort of this voiceless, mostly voiceless character that you control. So all of the personality comes from the companions around Alex. But seeing them go through what they're going through, along with the sort of the love interest between Nash and Mia, and Kyle and Jessica, and of course Alex and Luna, they're the point. It's not the big reveals. It's the journey. And that's one of the things that I love. From a gaming standpoint, Lunar also did a lot of what I felt relatively new things. The battle system in particular in Lunar is fantastic, in that you're still on this sort of screen where you've got these tiny little representations of your characters, and these tiny little representations of the enemies you're fighting, a la Final Fantasy, where the enemies are on the left, your characters are on the right. But the difference here is that range matters, and that when you're fighting, you actually have to consider how far your characters can move. So you want to make sure that you're attacking something that's close enough. If you're using melee attack, if you have a ranged attack, obviously it's a little bit different. But character positioning, while you don't have total control over it, you can control it, which I always thought was such a great mechanic, something that I hadn't seen before, that sort of makes the game stand out on its own as far as game mechanics goes. Other than that, though, again, it's mostly the narrative. And again, the nice thing was that we got to play this here, which wasn't as common as it is now. You didn't have all of these different companies that were localizing Japanese RPGs in Canada and the United States back in the early 90s. Working Designs was kind of a trailblazer when it came to that. For better or worse, again, Working Designs, it's a bit divisive. And I think that actually going back and playing this game now, I appreciate it in a different way than I did when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was just kind of happy to have an RPG that had been localized, and had been localized well. We didn't have a whole lot of situations like you saw in, well, even some of the previous games I mentioned, or like, say, Zelda 2 or something like that, where you had a really broken English translation or a really literal English translation that didn't sound natural and lost detail because of the translation. Working Designs definitely made everything seem coherent, and again wrote the characters with personality. I think for the most part they have the personalities they had in the Japanese version. I didn't really know when I was a kid, and I didn't really care. But going back and playing it now, I will say the downside to that being so contemporary at the time is that it's actually made the game feel, the translation at least, feel a little more dated, especially with some of the clear references to like different political humor and even different advertising jingles and that sort of thing. And I'm struggling to think of one in particular here, but I know as I was playing, I was like, oh yeah, I remember those ads for like Alka-Seltzer that he's referencing here. That was funny back in 1993, but now it just makes the game feel like it's from 1993. But all that being said, it holds up in that it is a coherent story. The main characters are well written. The main plot is well written. And I think that's what makes it still worth playing today. The other thing that I love about Lunar is that it's endured in such a way because it's seen some remakes. Again, much like Star Wars, for better or worse, the creators didn't sit on this original story. And I think that's great because it's on a system that wasn't necessarily super popular. So the story didn't necessarily get out to as many people as it should have back in the early 90s. So, of course, there's the remake, Silver Star Story, on the Saturn and PlayStation 1 that, again, Working Designs brought over here to the PlayStation 1. That widely expands the story and also, again, is focusing so much on narrative. And now, instead of these sort of sprite-based, computer-animated cutscenes, we actually got full-motion video animated cutscenes that were just absolutely gorgeous, which was a huge selling point for this. But I think a lot of people also don't realize that Lunar made its way to the Game Boy Advance with a game called Lunar Legend, which I found really fascinating because it really, while the overarching plot and story remains the same, the story beats were mixed up so much to the point that a character you meet in the original game, well past the point that you've done your first quest and you've gotten the Dragon Diamond and you're trying to go to Maribia in the mainland, you meet the character Nash just before you're going to go to the mainland. In Lunar Legend, you meet him within the first 5 minutes. And he's got a sort of the same, yet a sort of completely different task and journey that he's on. So it's awesome. And then Silver Star Harmony on the PSP also came out, and the one thing that did that I really loved was that it has a prologue where you actually play as the four heroes, Dyne, Galleon, Lemia, and Mel, just to get a little bit of a taste of what happened before Alex's journey. and also a bit of a teaser for, I feel, a prequel that never was created and should have been created surrounding those 4 heroes. That's sort of the big tragedy of the Lunar series, is that it started so strong. Eternal Blue was good as well, but like Star Wars, they had this amazing backstory that could have been mined for more games, but instead we got a terrible sequel on the DS, and then that was the end of the series. Although, also like Star Wars, considering how the prequels turned out, maybe it's for the best that most of what happened to Dine, Gallian, Lamia, and Mel stays in our imaginations. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, just a chance for me to gush over one of my favorite games of all time. So I highly recommend playing the Sega CD original if you can. As I've mentioned, if you've played the other 3 remakes, while they're great games, you haven't really necessarily experienced exactly what the first game had to offer. So I highly recommend doing that. Thank you again for listening. Thanks for this opportunity, and I hope you enjoyed it. Happy gaming.
Hey,
Oh, hey, Jeff.
what's going on, guys?
Oh, talking about Superman.
Oh, cool. I could talk about Superman.
I could talk some more about Superman.
We know.
I'll bet a few people would want to get in on this.
I'm down.
You know it.
That sounds like fun. I'll do it.
Cool, let's do it. We can call the show Men of Steel.
And you can find it at certainpov.com.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yay.
CertainPOV.com.